to my Borderpolar podcast. This is the second in a series called BPD Vocab, episode 2. Today we're going to talk about the phenomenon of the favorite person. Why do I call it a phenomenon? Well, the favorite person idea or concept isn't listed in the DSM. It's not listed in the diagnostic manual. And from what I can find, there's no specific research out there available in terms of what psychology has to say about the favorite person. I can't find a standard definition, so most of my resources are going to be from blogs and things like that. I did find one study that monitored the brain activity of people when they were exposed to images of their favorite person, but it seems like it was used with famous people being their favorite people. But they did notice several different areas of the brain being um, ignited during exposure to these favorite people. And there's also a gene that they've isolated that people with this gene have a different type of serotonin response when they are exposed to their favorite people, but neither of these have to do with borderline personality disorder. However, there are definite brain changes that take place when someone is exposed to their favorite person, which is applicable to understanding why it would make sense that people with borderline personality disorder have a favorite person kind of relationship or phenomenon going on. It is, however, even though it's not addressed necessarily in the DSM, or I can't find a lot of research about it in terms of what psychology has to say and science and everything, it is widely understood by the borderline personality disorder community. So people who are on the borderline personality spectrum. And in that, it's also very personalized and very individualized. So you're going to find a lot of different ways that one could explain what a favorite person is. But the one thing they all have in common is that there are unhealthy dynamics in a favorite person relationship. And so we're going to explore a little bit about that. And one thing to remember is that if you find yourself with someone as your favorite person, it's not your choice, but it is your responsibility. So there are things we have to do in order to make sure that we don't have unhealthy relationships because of the favorite person phenomenon, and that our behavior is still respectful and within boundaries. So the favorite person defined. A favorite person is different than a best friend. A favorite person will most a lot of times determine what your mood is going to be. So if your favorite person's in a good mood, you might be in a good mood. If they're upset, you might be upset. A lot of times we're going to chameleon ourselves with regards to their emotions and their interests and things like that. A favorite person can be someone that you idealize and then at sometimes devalue based on whether or not you're getting what you feel you need from this favorite person. You might feel like you can't function without your favorite person. Someone you desperately want to make happy, and you'll do almost anything to try and meet their needs. A favorite person is someone who, more than, say, a best friend or a close friend, would consume your thoughts and consume your energy. You might experience extreme jealousy if your favorite person pays attention to someone else or mentions someone else in a positive way. You will experience intense fears of abandonment with regards to your favorite person. You'll feel a need for constant reassurance from this person, and you might experience bits of paranoia when it comes to your favorite person in terms of if you can't get a hold of them, or if they're like I said, if they're complimenting someone else, talking to someone else, mentioning someone else, you might experience moments of paranoia in there where you feel like it means that you're not good enough, or that they don't want you in their life, or that someone else is more important to them than you are. And these are all sort of what you would lump into the definition of a favorite person. But like I said, there's not an actual definition because it's not something that I can tell that psychology has recognized as a part of borderline personality disorder, even though it's clear that people with borderline personality disorder experience this favorite person relationship and favorite person dynamics. So the favorite person dynamics, the idealization and devaluation. So if you find yourself having someone in your life who you feel you just idolize sort of or idealize, and you kind of feel like they can do no wrong, and you want to have every positive feeling coming from them in terms of who you are. Um, they're someone who you might have a distorted sense of, or unreasonable expectations about them. So you might think that they should be available to you all the time, or that they should be giving you their attention rather than someone else. And you might hold them to these standards that are really unrealistic for another person to fulfill. And if you're not getting what you feel you need from them, say you're not able to get in touch with them, or they're not giving you the reassurance that you need, you might start to devalue them. I see a lot of people on the support groups talking about going off on their favorite person. And that might happen if you aren't able to control your behavior within the dynamics of the favorite person relationship. It's a very dependency based, kind of a codependent relationship. Well, not so much codependent, because it's probably just more one way in that you're dependent on them more than they're dependent on you. But it's very dependency based. And I was watching some videos by a man named Dr. Fox on YouTube, and I included a link in my references to his video library and everything. But he talked about how people might feel like they're having a missing piece of themselves, and that this favorite person sort of fills that empty space or that missing piece that they have. And one of the things that people will do in a favorite person relationship often is push the other person away, push the favorite person away, sort of testing the boundaries and then trying to confirm that, yes, in fact, even if you push those boundaries, the favorite person will stay. And in this way, oftentimes people push the favorite person away when what they're trying to do is just desperately keep them as close as they can. And so testing your boundaries, picking fights, starting arguments, noticing things that you may perceive as slights, you may perceive as your favorite person not being happy with you, is really just perception. And when you're over needy or over clingy or over emotional with regards to your favorite person, you might actually end up pushing them out of your life. And that's a way that people sort of test and then try and confirm that their favorite person is in fact going to love them and stick around. But it backfires pretty often. Favorite person and BPD symptoms. So if you're familiar with this favorite person phenomenon, if you have experienced having a favorite person in your life, and I know I have, I wasn't diagnosed with borderline personality disorder until I was about 35 years old. And I had been talking about my favorite person ever since I could remember. When I was young, it was my brother, and I used to introduce him to people and say, "This is my brother. He's my favorite person in the whole world." And when I look back, he fulfilled the role for me of the favorite person. It was very important to me that I met his needs. It was very important to me that he was taken care of. And if he was down, I was down. And if he was happy, I was happy. And we spent a lot of time together. And I definitely depended on him for a lot of my emotional regulation. And that's not fair to another human being, really. My favorite person then became my eventual husband and now ex-husband. And I had other favorite people, one or two other favorite people during the time I was married. And then after my divorce was finalized, I realized that my favorite people were often romantic interests from then on. And I've come to the conclusion that having a favorite person is not really a healthy dynamic, and it is something that we have to take responsibility for and we have to be accountable for in our behaviors and our actions and everything. But if we take a look at what the favorite person phenomenon means and the symptoms of BPD, it will make a whole lot of sense as to why someone with borderline personality disorder might develop this sort of dynamic in a relationship where they become so dependent on someone else for their emotional state, and they become so dependent on someone else for feeling like they exist, feeling like they are human, feeling like they have value. And so if we start with just the first symptom of borderline personality disorder, frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment, well, that's right in there. There's an intense fear when it comes to having a favorite person that they're going to leave, that they're not going to be there, that you're going to be missing them. And that stems right from this symptom of frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. And you'll see people You might, if you have friends with borderline personality disorder, if you're a part of the support groups online, you might see this kind of dynamic where you'll hear people talking about how they blew up on their favorite person or they can't believe their favorite person did X, Y, Z, when it's really just normal behavior for anyone to exhibit. But because we have these frantic efforts to avoid abandonment, we're going to look at situations in a certain light, in a certain way, and it's going to have an emotional effect on you that it might not have on someone outside of the borderline personality spectrum. A pattern of unstable relationships characterized by that extremes and idealization and devaluation is right there in the favorite person dynamic. And it applies to the favorite person relationship. And oftentimes, this might be the person who most people will split on. And that's what you're talking about here with the extremes, that black and white thinking. Your favorite person might be someone who you split on more often than anyone else. And again, when you split and when you argue and when you get mad or when you express extra clinginess, extra neediness, extra emotional attachment, what you're really doing is exhibiting those frantic efforts to avoid abandonment and at the same time going back between idealization and devaluation of that person. And that's part of those pattern of unstable relationships that people with borderline personality disorder have. Another one we want to look at is identity disturbances. So without having a solid sense of self, without really feeling like you know who you are, oftentimes people with BPD will develop a chameleon type of personality for the people around them, and this extends to the favorite person relationship in a pretty big way because oftentimes you'll take on their interests and their mannerisms and their way of the way that they do things. You'll sort of take on a chameleon role and sort of become like your favorite person instead of being like what you are, if you can figure out what you are. But that's a really difficult thing for people with borderline personality to do because of these identity disturbances and this unstable sense of self and unstable self-image that we have. Again, with the chronic feelings of emptiness, those might be heightened in those moments, especially when you can't get in touch with your favorite person. If, say, they're not texting you back right away, or they're not answering your phone calls, or you haven't seen them in a while, those chronic feelings of emptiness can be exasperated, can be much greater when it has to do with being apart from your favorite person. Impulsivity, self-damaging behavior, and inappropriate anger, three different symptoms of borderline personality disorder, will all show up sometimes when it comes to the favorite person. If you're going to be reactive to something that they say that may sound like they're criticizing you, something that they say that may sound like they're not happy with you, something that they may say or do that may make you think anything other than them having positive feelings towards you, it might result in impulsivity and behavior, self-damaging behavior, or that inappropriate anger that goes along with the devaluation of those unstable relationships and that black and white thinking. And then the same goes with the affective instability of mood. The reactivity of mood symptom of BPD will be seen oftentimes in reaction to something that goes on with the favorite person not being as favorable as the person with BPD would like it to be. And then I mentioned paranoia already, and dissociation can happen too if you're having a reaction to something that your favorite person has that you've perceived that they've done or haven't done that adds to the stress of what's going on inside of you. And so if you can't get a hold of your favorite person, you might experience a deluge of these symptoms. And you know what that feels like if you have that favorite person relationship. You know that it feels like literally the world is going to end because you haven't gotten in touch with this person. And it seems overreactive when you put it that way, but that's the reality of how one feels when they have a favorite person relationship and it isn't giving them what they perceive that they need out of it. So let's talk a little bit about managing a favorite person relationship. I found that the best way to manage a favorite person relationship is to first make an effort to avoid having that dynamic in your life. When you notice that someone is quickly becoming super, super, super important to you and your well-being, try to take a step back. Try to remember that that dynamic of having someone that you rely on to determine your emotional state or that you rely on to determine who you believe you are as a person is very unrealistic and it's very unfair to that other person. It places demands on them and pressure on them that they're not going to like as time goes on and the relationship gets more and more intense. So we have to really focus on setting boundaries for our behavior. So if you feel the need to lash out at your favorite person for any reason, like say they haven't called you back, they haven't texted you back, or they're spending time with someone else, and you feel that need to lash out, it's our responsibility as someone with borderline personality disorder to stop that behavior because it's unhealthy and it's unfair and it's unrealistic. And then another thing that you want to try to do is keep an eye on those chameleon tendencies. If you notice something about your favorite person and you start taking on those same things, try to notice that and pull back and remember that you are your own person and focus instead on analyzing what the benefits of that relationship is. What is the benefit to me to have this person in my life? And if the only benefit you can come to is I want them there because I love them, but they aren't adding to your life in some other way, or they're maybe taking advantage of the amount of dependency that you place on them, because that can happen too. You want to analyze that relationship and try to take a step back and see what behaviors you can change to make it something that's more enriching in your life. And the key to all of that, the key to all of these things, to being not so dependent on a favorite person, not so emotionally dependent, and even physically, because you can feel physically ill, physically sick when you can't get in touch with them or when things aren't going the way that you want them to go with that relationship. Practicing self-love is really the key to figuring out how to avoid the dynamic of a favorite person and to keep that relationship in a realistic setting with realistic boundaries and maintaining who you are separate from who they are. And self-love is difficult. And if you're interested in a little bit more about self-love, I do have a video about that. But there's stuff all over the internet about how to practice self-love, and practicing it is the key to eventually feeling it. I haven't quite gotten there yet, but I work on it all the time. And as someone who's actively trying to avoid that favorite person dynamic, it's very, very difficult to overcome those feelings of feared abandonment and those feelings of dependency on someone else. And so it takes a lot of practice and a lot of patience. And it's not easy, but this favorite person dynamic is something, like I said, that isn't really mentioned necessarily in psychology. Your psychologists might know about it if they're familiar with borderline personality disorder. Your psychiatrists might know about it if they're familiar with borderline personality disorder. But the people in the borderline personality disorder community really understand this favorite person relationship and this favorite person dynamic. But what's key to it is recognizing that in its natural state, if you just let it go and you just let this person be your favorite person, it's really an unhealthy dynamic for you. And self-love, there's a lot more that can be said about a favorite person and the dynamic between someone with borderline personality disorder and how they feel about their favorite person and what an impact having that relationship has on your life. And if you're talking to someone who doesn't experience it, they really aren't going to understand. But for those of us that have borderline personality disorder and those of us that have experienced the favorite person dynamic, we can really look at one another in the eye and say, I understand how difficult it is. It's it's rewarding if you can manage it in a way that isn't detrimental to you, but doing that is really difficult, and self-love is really the way to go. I have two references here at the top that link to those studies that I was talking about at the beginning, but again, those are not about borderline personality disorder. They're just about brain function and what a favorite person or favorite person exposure would do to someone's brain. And I'm going to talk a lot more about the brain and borderline personality disorder in my next video series of a borderpolar diagnosis called Navigating Your Brain. And so we'll go more into depth about how the brain is affected by borderline personality disorder there, but those links to a couple of abstracts on some articles there. And then the other references I have, aside from Dr. Fox at the bottom, are just from some basically blogs that I found, because there really isn't much out there in terms of research as far as the favorite person phenomenon or favorite person concept goes. But I would suggest looking at Dr. Fox's videos if you're interested in a different perspective from um, someone with a doctorate in psychology as opposed to myself, who's someone who lives with borderline personality disorder and just has a degree in biology. He has a lot of good things to say and a lot of really helpful videos out there if you were interested in that. Um, I've just been exposed to him, so I don't know everything that he has, but I really did get a lot from the couple of videos that I watched. I don't, I could go on and on about how it feels to have a favorite person and the highs and lows. Um, but it's, like I said, very personal to each person and very individualized to each person. And if you ask someone with BPD what their favorite person is to them, you might get a myriad of responses, a variety of answers. But basically, that dependency, the fear of abandonment, the emotional regulation, and the emotional dependency that you have on that favorite person is pretty much across the board. Trying to navigate that in a healthy way is very difficult, but it must be done because the relationship itself, if not um, monitored, if not checked, is really unhealthy for a person with BPD, because if that favorite person does decide that they no longer want you in your life, it can feel soul crushing and it can send you into quite the depression that might be very difficult to get out of. So trying to avoid that dynamic in the first place might be the very best way to go. And again, self-love is really the key to that. Um, Coming up, I have another video, like I said, called Navigating Your Brain on my Borderpolar diagnosis series. If you want to check that out, if you're interested in these videos, feel free to like and subscribe and share them if there's anyone you think might be useful or might find them useful. Feel free to share in in the comments what a favorite person means to you. If I didn't quite get something that matches what your explanation would be, because it's really different for each person, and I'd be interested to see what you think of it as well. I hope that you found this definition or this BPD vocab um, somewhat helpful. If not, at least maybe you found out that you're not alone. So I hope you have a nice day, and thank you for joining me on my Border Polar podcast.